Okay, so tech, right? It's like every time you blink, something else that seemed impossible is suddenly popping up on your feed.
It's moving so fast.
Smartphones,
Yeah.
AI that can write jingles. But now we're talking about actually engineering life itself. Like,
Building with biology.
exactly. And that's where we're diving in today with synthetic biology, right?
Exactly.
We're not just mapping DNA anymore. This is about rewriting the code, like using biology as a building block.
It's mind-boggling when you think about it. Instead of building with bricks or code, we're talking about molecular Legos.
So instead of building with bricks or code, we're
Yeah.
building with, like, molecular Legos.
Yeah.
That's both awe-inspiring and a little intimidating.
A little bit of both, for sure. The potential is incredible. Custom-designed medicines, biofuels that could change how we think about energy, materials we haven't even dreamed up yet.
Right.
But as with any powerful tool, there are always questions about the implications, right? The what-ifs.
Right, because this feels bigger than just, will robots take over the world? This is messing with the very building blocks of life.
Yeah.
Luckily for us, security expert Brett Edwards dives headfirst into these dilemmas in his book, Insecurity and Emerging Biotechnology. We've got excerpts for this deep dive, and let me tell you, they get right to the heart of how we handle these new technologies.
Yeah, it's such a timely book, too. What really struck me about Edward's work is how he frames these challenges. He calls them the three paradoxes. And they're not just about synthetic biology. He connects them to, the whole way we approach innovation as a society.
Okay, let's unpack this. What's the first paradox that'll make my brain bend a little?
Okay, so he calls the first one the innovator's paradox.
Okay.
And it gets at the heart of a question people have grappled with for centuries, really. Are scientists solely pursuing knowledge, or do they bear responsibility for how their creations are used, especially when those creations could have unintended and far-reaching consequences?
That's a heavy one, and something that feels really relevant even in our daily lives, like with social media.
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
It started as this cool way to connect, and now look at the debates around misinformation and mental health.
Yeah.
It's tough to predict those ripple effects.
Yeah, it's like throwing a stone in a pond. Those ripples just keep going. And Edwards actually uses a compelling modern example. Those Google employees who protested the company's work on military AI projects, remember that?
Right.
It sparked a huge debate, right, about whether scientists can or even should try to separate their work from its potential applications.
Which feels almost impossible when you're talking about something as powerful as engineering life itself. I mean, how do you separate pure scientific pursuit from the very real ways it could change the world, for good or for bad?
It's a tough one, and this ethical tightrope isn't new either. Take Fritz Haber, for instance.
Right.
He was a chemist who won a Nobel Prize for his work on ammonia synthesis.
Impressive.
Oh, absolutely. The discovery was instrumental in developing fertilizers that helped feed millions, maybe billions of people. But
There's always a but.
there always is, isn't there? That same process was later used to create chemical weapons during World War I.
That's a chilling example. Incredible breakthroughs, but then this dark side emerges that's hard to predict, even harder to control.
It's that duality of innovation, and it gets even more tragic with Haber. You see, his wife, Clara Immerwahr, was a brilliant chemist herself.
Oh, wow.
And she was absolutely horrified by her husband's involvement in chemical weapons development. It created this unbearable conflict for her, and tragically, she ended up taking her own life.
That story really highlights how scientific progress isn't just about discoveries in a lab, isn't it? It's about people, choices, and very real, very human consequences. It makes you question the narrative of progress we often hear, which I'm guessing leads us right into paradox number 2. It really does. Like you said, that duality. It's not always a straight line to a better world, is it?
No, it's rarely that simple. And you've hit on the perfect segue to the second paradox Edwards lays out. He calls it the innovation paradox.
Okay.
And it gets at this almost blind faith we have in innovation as a society. New tech must be good. It's going to solve all our problems.
Which, let's be honest, it's often how it's sold to us.
Yeah.
Shiny new gadgets, cures for diseases, a brighter future, all that.
Exactly. But that's where the paradox comes in, right? Because this very innovation, this drive to create and discover, often comes with, well, let's call them unintended consequences. And those consequences, they can snowball, creating a whole new set of problems, sometimes even bigger than the ones we were trying to solve in the first place.
It's like we're so focused on what could be that we don't see the potential downsides until it's too late. And with something like synthetic biology, those downsides could be huge.
Exactly. And Edwards is really good about connecting these big ideas to tangible concerns. Like, he draws parallels to those anxieties we're already seeing around AI,
Yeah.
gene editing, the potential for bioweapons. It all stems from this tension, the promise of innovation butting up against the very real fear of unintended consequences.
So it's not just about whether we can do something, but whether we should. And I guess who gets to decide that when it comes to something as potentially world-altering as synthetic biology?
Exactly. And that leads us really neatly to what Edwards calls the third and maybe the most unsettling paradox of them all, the global insecurity paradox.
Okay.
It boils down to this. Scientific progress doesn't happen in a vacuum, right?
Right.
Even if one country, one lab, one group of scientists, they all agree we're going to be cautious, there's always the risk that someone else won't.
So it becomes this impossible race to stay ahead. Even researching something for peaceful purposes could be perceived as a threat by somebody else.
It's a tightrope walk. Edwards uses a really interesting example, actually. He talks about how the U.S. itself might be driving an arms race in synthetic biology just by the research being done. There was even a Chinese delegate at a meeting about the Biological Weapons Convention who brought this up.
Really?
It highlights how even the perception of a threat, not even necessarily a real threat, but the perception of it, can fuel escalation and mistrust on a global scale.
Okay, so just to recap here, we've got scientists grappling with their own role in potentially dangerous discoveries.
Yeah.
We've got the promise of progress all tangled up with these terrifying what-ifs. And on top of all that, there's the potential for a global arms race in a technology that could literally rewrite the code of life. This is,
It's a lot.
it really is. And to Edwards' credit, he doesn't just drop these paradoxes on us and walk away. He digs deeper into the hopes and fears surrounding synthetic biology specifically, He really wants to figure out, are we even equipped to deal with something this powerful? So where do we even begin to unravel this? Like, does synthetic biology automatically equal a global security nightmare?
Not necessarily. Not automatically, no. One of the things that Edwards highlights is how this new technology, how it was presented to the world, both the utopian dreams and those dystopian fears, it's kind of a pattern we see with emerging technologies.
Right.
And understanding that pattern, that's crucial here.
Right, because how we talk about these things, the narratives we build, that shapes how we approach them, how we regulate them, even how we fear them.
Exactly. It sets the stage. And synthetic biology, well, it was presented as revolutionary, right? The potential to cure diseases, create clean energy, maybe even solve world hunger. But alongside those hopes, you had those fears bubbling up. Bioweapons, designer babies, ecological disaster, this whole hype cycle. It's like a roller coaster we've been on before with other technologies.
It's almost like we need that dose of sci-fi fear to balance out the sci-fi optimism.
Mm-hmm.
But like you said, in reality, it's rarely that black and white.
Mm-hmm.
Did anyone try to get ahead of this? Like, did anyone see these potential pitfalls and try to steer things in a safer direction?
Oh, absolutely. There were attempts at self-regulation within the scientific community itself, for sure. But it wasn't exactly a unified front. There were some George Church, the geneticist. He believed that we needed really strict controls and surveillance around this tech. He felt, understandably, that we couldn't afford to be naive about the risks.
Which, knowing what we know now about gene editing and all the ethical dilemmas swirling around that, it's not a crazy stance to take.
Not at all. But on the other side of that coin, you had those who advocated for a more open, collaborative approach. They believed that transparency and information sharing, those are the best ways to prevent misuse, to actually accelerate progress safely.
Interesting. So you had this clash of perspectives right out of the gate, which, given what we talked about with those paradoxes, feels almost inevitable. But what's fascinating is that it wasn't just the scientists calling the shots here.
Right.
Edwards talks about the role of organizations like DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and the Sloan Foundation in shaping not just the research itself, but the ethical conversations around it too.
Which makes sense when you think about it.
Right. You've got government agencies, private foundations, scientists with different viewpoints.
Yeah.
It could have easily just dissolved into chaos.
Right. It could have, absolutely. But what's interesting is that those early discussions, even with all the disagreements and different perspectives, they actually laid the groundwork for some important initiatives.
Oh. What?
One example that Edwards highlights is the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity, or NSABB. They put out this report that identified what they called experiments of concern.
So like red flags, research that could be easily misused or could have really dangerous implications.
Exactly, things to keep an eye on. And they also recommended guidelines for screening DNA synthesis orders, trying to, keep potentially dangerous genetic material out of the wrong hands. So even amidst all this uncertainty and debate, there were proactive steps being taken.
Which is reassuring, I guess, at least to some extent. But it still feels like playing catch-up, doesn't it? I mean, technology moves so fast. How do you create guidelines for something that's constantly evolving, especially when you have different countries, different regulations, different priorities?
Ah, the million-dollar question. And that's something Edwards doesn't shy away from, that complexity. He highlights how difficult global governance really is, especially with something as fast-moving as biotechnology.
Yeah.
He gives this fascinating example about how gene synthesis technology is actually regulated differently in the US versus the UK, and those differences, they can create loopholes, inconsistencies.
So even if one country implements strict regulations, it only takes one weak link in the chain to potentially create a global security risk.
That's the challenge. And it's why Edwards emphasizes the need for ongoing dialogue and collaboration. This isn't a problem with a simple fix, a checklist we can tick off and move on. It requires, I think, a fundamental shift in how we even think about innovation itself.
It's like we're so used to focusing on the can we that we forget to ask, should we? And even when we do remember to ask it, there's not always a clear answer.
And that, right there, that's why engaging with these questions is so important. Because as technology keeps advancing, those questions are only going to become more complex, and the stakes, well, they're only getting higher. And that's what I appreciate about Edwards' book. It's not just a warning about the potential dangers of synthetic biology. It's like a call to action for all of us.
Okay, so where do we go from here? What do we do with all of this information? This sense of awe at what's possible, but also this very real fear of what we might unleash. It's a lot to process, right? Like we're standing at the edge of something massive, breakthroughs that could reshape the world as we know it. But there's this shadow, this fear of what we don't know, and the very real possibility that we might not be able to control what we create.
And that's exactly the challenge Edwards puts forth. He wants us to sit with that discomfort, that tension between the wonder and the worry, because ignoring it won't make it go away.
So what do? Do we just become passive observers, hoping for the best, but kind of bracing for the worst? Or is there actual agency here? Can we do something?
It's the big question, isn't it? And what I find refreshing about Edwards' approach is he doesn't pretend to have all the answers. He's not saying, here's what's going to happen.
Because how could you?
Yeah.
We're talking about forces that are constantly shifting and changing, interacting in ways we probably haven't even thought of yet.
Exactly. But what he does offer is a framework. He gives us a way to understand these dilemmas, to ask the right questions. And that's where we come in, I think. Our role as individuals, as citizens, that's where it gets real.
So it's bigger than just the scientists in their labs or politicians debating policy. It's about all of us grappling with these issues. But where do we even begin?
Awareness, I think, is the first step. Educating ourselves about the technologies being developed, the potential consequences. I mean, hey, that's what we're doing right here on the deep dive. But it doesn't end there. It can't. We have to go beyond just understanding the tech itself. Think bigger picture.
Like, how is this going to affect our everyday lives?
Yeah.
And our jobs,
Yeah.
our relationships, the very fabric of society.
All of it. And that means being willing to ask tough questions, to challenge assumptions, even to be a little skeptical, I think, of the narratives we're being fed.
It's easy to get caught up in the excitement, right? The promise of a better future. That's a powerful motivator.
It really is. But technology, at the end of the day, is a tool. And like any tool, it can be used for good or bad. It comes down to the choices we make. And those choices, they're not just being made in labs or government buildings. They're made every day by each and every one of us.
Okay, so how do we become more than just passive consumers of technology? How do we actually influence its direction? How do we make sure it's used to benefit humanity?
It starts with conversations like this. It starts with staying informed, staying engaged, demanding transparency from the people developing these technologies, holding them accountable.
And I guess being willing to have those difficult conversations, right, with our friends, our families, our communities, because these aren't just abstract ideas. They're going to impact all of us in one way or another.
They absolutely will. And, Edwards' book focuses specifically on synthetic biology, and we've gone deep on those dilemmas, but his larger point is much broader. This is just the beginning. AI, nanotechnology, quantum computing. These fields all have the potential to fundamentally reshape the world.
So the questions we've been asking today, They're not going away anytime soon. If anything, they're going to become even more important.
And more complicated.
Absolutely.
Which is why we can't shy away from the conversation.
Yeah.
We need to approach these advancements with a sense of wonder, for sure, but also with responsibility, with a willingness to ask those tough questions, even if the answers are difficult.
That's a powerful message. And I'll be honest, it's a little intimidating. But also, it's empowering. We do have a say in this. We have a voice. And the choices that we make today, they're the ones that are going to determine the kind of future we build.
And that's really what the deep dive is all about, right? Giving you, the listener, the tools you need to go beyond the headlines, to really dig into these complex issues, to form your own informed conclusions.
Because the future isn't something that just happens to us. It's something we create. And we can create it consciously, thoughtfully, and most importantly, with our eyes wide open. This has been The Deep Dive. Thanks for exploring with us.